A man sits in a quiet suburban diner with his 8-year-old daughter, laughing over a plate of chocolate chip pancakes. 5 minutes later, he is dragged out in handcuffs, humiliated in front of the entire restaurant by an arrogant cop with a badge and a massive chip on his shoulder. Officer Greg Wilson thought he was just bullying another defenseless citizen he felt didn't belong in his wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood. What he didn't realize was that he had just illegally detained and assaulted the Honorable District Judge Arthur Pendleton. This single racially motivated and arrogant mistake wouldn't just cost the officer his career, it would force the city to pay out a staggering $1.1 million settlement and trigger a federal investigation. This is the unbelievable true story of how blind prejudice met the ultimate, devastating karma. The Oak Creek Diner in Fairview, Ohio, was the kind of local institution where everyone knew the waitstaff by name, and the coffee was always hot, if a little bitter. It was 9:15 a.m. on a crisp Saturday morning in October. The bell above the glass door chimed every few minutes, bringing in bursts of autumn air and families fresh from morning errands or youth sports. In the corner booth, by a window overlooking the modest Main Street, sat Arthur Pendleton and his 8-year-old daughter, Chloe. They had just come from the local recreational complex where Chloe's under-9 soccer team had fought to a breathless, muddy draw. Arthur, a devoted father, was wearing the unofficial uniform of a weekend dad, a pair of worn-out gray sweatpants, grass-stained sneakers, and a faded, oversized navy blue Georgetown University hoodie with a frayed drawcord. He hadn't shaved, sporting a thick shadow of stubble, and his short black hair was tucked under a plain, unbranded baseball cap. To anyone looking closely, the lines of exhaustion around his deep brown eyes hinted at a high-stress career. But to a casual observer, he was just a tired, unassuming black man trying to enjoy a weekend breakfast with his kid. "Dad, can I get extra whipped cream?" Chloe asked, kicking her cleats happily against the vinyl booth beneath the table. She was still wearing her bright yellow soccer jersey, her braids tied back with matching yellow ribbons. "Only if you promise not to tell your mother I let you eat sugar before noon." Arthur smiled, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that commanded respect, even in its warmest tones. He signaled to Sarah Jenkins, a college student who worked weekend shifts to pay off her nursing degree. "Extra whipped cream coming right up, Arthur," Sarah beamed, walking over with a fresh pot of coffee. She liked the Pendletons. They were generous tippers and exceptionally polite, a stark contrast to the demanding Sunday church crowd. As Sarah poured Arthur's coffee, the bell above the door chimed again. The atmosphere in the diner didn't exactly freeze, but there was a palpable shift, a tightening. In walked Officer Greg Wilson. Wilson was a 12-year veteran of the Fairview Police Department, a man whose physical presence was built entirely around his authority. He was tall, heavily built, with a shaved head and a meticulously trimmed goatee. He wore his uniform tight, his duty belt heavy with gear, and a pair of dark aviator sunglasses rested on the back of his neck. Wilson had a reputation in Fairview. Among certain circles, he was considered a no-nonsense cop keeping the town safe. But among the minority residents who commuted through or lived on the outskirts of the affluent suburb, he was a known hazard. He was the kind of officer who would pull you over for a taillight that wasn't actually broken, or tail your car for 3 miles just to check your plate. Wilson strutted to the counter, greeting Thomas Croft, the diner's manager. "Morning, Tom." The usual to go. "Right away, Greg," Thomas said, rushing to get a large black coffee and a bacon sandwich. As Wilson waited, he turned his back to the counter, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. His pale blue eyes scanned the dining room. He watched the elderly couples reading the morning paper. He watched the teenagers in the middle booths. And then, his eyes locked onto the corner booth. He saw Arthur. In Wilson's mind, the scene didn't compute. Fairview was an affluent, quiet town. He saw a black man in a ratty, oversized hoodie, unshaven, sitting in a booth. Wilson's implicit biases, honed by years of unchecked authority, flared up immediately. He didn't see a father bonding with his daughter. He saw someone who didn't fit the profile of the neighborhood. He saw a vagrant, or perhaps someone looking to cause trouble. He ignored the little girl in the bright yellow soccer uniform entirely. His focus was entirely on Arthur's faded clothes and the color of his skin. Wilson slowly unhooked his thumbs from his belt. He took a slow, deliberate step away from the counter, leaving his waiting breakfast behind. Sarah Jenkins, returning from the kitchen with a plate of excessively whipped cream-topped pancakes, saw Wilson moving toward the corner booth. Her stomach dropped. She had seen Wilson do this before to delivery drivers and out-of-town landscapers. Arthur was in the middle of wiping a smudge of dirt off Chloe's cheek with a napkin when a large shadow fell over their table. He didn't look up immediately, assuming it was Thomas or another patron squeezing past. "Can I help you?" Arthur asked mildly, finally looking up to see the polished silver badge and the stern, aggressive scowl of Officer Greg Wilson. "I need to see some identification," Wilson said. It wasn't a request. The tone was sharp, flat, and heavily laced with an expectation of immediate submission. Arthur paused. The warm, relaxed father vanished in a fraction of a second. In his place emerged the Honorable Arthur Pendleton, a man who had spent 2 decades in the legal system, first as a ruthless defense attorney, then as a brilliant prosecutor, and finally as a highly respected judge in the 4th District Court. His mind, trained to process legal parameters, constitutional rights, and human behavior at lightning speed, evaluated the situation. "Excuse me," Arthur replied, keeping his voice low and steady. "You heard me," Wilson barked, leaning in slightly, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate. "I said, I need to see your ID." Chloe stopped eating. Her fork hovered over her pancakes, her big eyes darting between her father and the angry police officer. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's okay, sweetie. Eat your breakfast," Arthur reassured her without breaking eye contact with Wilson. He placed his napkin carefully on the table. "Officer, my daughter and I are just having breakfast. Is there a problem?" "The problem is you're making people uncomfortable," Wilson lied effortlessly. It was a standard line, a catch-all excuse he used to justify Terry stops without reasonable suspicion. "We've had some issues with transients in this area. I need to know who you are and what your business is here." Arthur's jaw tightened. The sheer audacity of the lie, the blatant racial profiling occurring in broad daylight, ignited a cold, calculated fire inside him. But Arthur knew the law better than the man wearing the badge. He knew that in the state of Ohio, an officer cannot demand identification without reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed. "I am perfectly aware of the law regarding stop and identify, officer," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the commanding, resonant tone he usually reserved for his courtroom. "And unless you have reasonable suspicion that I am committing a crime, I am not required to provide you with my identification while eating pancakes with my child." Wilson's face flushed red. He wasn't used to people knowing their rights, and he certainly wasn't used to being spoken to with such calm, unyielding authority by someone he had already mentally categorized as lesser. In Wilson's world, compliance was mandatory, and questions were considered a threat to his power. "Listen to me very carefully, buddy," Wilson sneered, his hand moving subconsciously to rest on the butt of his taser. "You're in my town now. You don't get to play lawyer with me. You're going to hand over your driver's license right now, or I'm going to drag you out of this booth for disorderly conduct." The diner had gone completely silent. The clatter of silverware, the murmur of conversation, even the hiss of the grill in the back seemed to evaporate. Every eye in the Oak Creek diner was fixed on the corner booth. Thomas Croft, the manager, stood frozen behind the cash register, wringing his hands. He wanted to intervene. He knew Arthur was a good customer, but he was terrified of getting on Wilson's bad side. Sarah Jenkins stood a few feet away, holding a pot of coffee, her knuckles white. "Disorderly conduct," Arthur repeated, tasting the words. He leaned back in his booth, crossing his arms. He wasn't trying to be difficult for the sake of ego. He was taking a stand. If a police officer could brazenly violate his Fourth Amendment rights in a crowded diner while he was with his daughter, what was this officer doing to young men on dark streets at midnight? Under what statute, officer? Arthur asked calmly. To be guilty of disorderly conduct, I would need to be engaging in fighting, threatening harm, or making unreasonable noise. Sitting here quietly, eating breakfast, and politely declining an unlawful order does not meet the statutory definition of disorderly conduct. Wilson's eyes went wide with fury. The legal jargon, the complete lack of fear, the fact that this man was exposing his ignorance in front of an audience, it was too much for the arrogant cop. His ego had been bruised, and in Wilson's playbook, a bruised ego required immediate, overwhelming physical force. "All right, that's it. Stand up." Wilson roared, his voice echoing off the tile walls. He stepped forward, reaching out and grabbing Arthur violently by the shoulder of his faded Georgetown hoodie. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified scream. "Leave my dad alone," she cried, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "Don't touch me," Arthur warned, his voice like cracking ice. He didn't resist physically. He knew better than to give a rogue cop an excuse to escalate to deadly force. But he didn't assist either. He stood up slowly, ensuring his hands were visible, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Put your hands behind your back," Wilson shouted, violently spinning Arthur around and slamming him face first against the large glass window of the diner. The glass shuddered under the impact. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Several patrons half stood looking horrified, but no one dared step forward. "Officer," Arthur said, his cheek pressed against the cold glass, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "I am calmly complying with your physical force to avoid a violent altercation in front of my daughter. But you are currently committing false arrest, false imprisonment, and assault under color of law." "Shut your mouth," Wilson spat, yanking Arthur's arms behind his back. The harsh, metallic clack-clack-clack of police handcuffs echoed loudly in the silent room. The metal dug painfully into Arthur's wrists as Wilson deliberately clamped them down one notch too tight. "Daddy!" Chloe was sobbing hysterically now, scrambling out of the booth and reaching for Arthur's leg. "Hey kid, back off," Wilson snapped, stepping between the little girl and her father. That was the moment the calm facade almost cracked. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a fierce, primal surge of protective rage swelling in his chest. The brilliant legal mind held the father's rage in check. "Stay calm. Document everything mentally. Do not give an excuse." "Chloe, look at me," Arthur said firmly, turning his head as best he could while pinned against the glass. "It's okay. Daddy is fine. Look at me, sweetie. Do not cry." Sarah Jenkins finally broke out of her paralysis. She rushed over, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around the terrified 8-year-old. "I've got her, Arthur," Sarah said, her voice shaking with tears of her own. She glared up at Wilson. "Greg, what is wrong with you?" "He wasn't doing anything. Interfering with an arrest, Sarah, and you'll go in the back of the cruiser too," Wilson threatened, his chest puffing out. He grabbed Arthur by the collar of his hoodie and the chain of the handcuffs. "Let's go, smart guy. We're taking a ride." "Sarah," Arthur said, ignoring the cop completely. "My wife's number is in my left front pocket. Call her. Tell her what happened. Tell her not to panic, just to meet me at the Fairview precinct." "I will," Sarah promised, holding tightly to a crying Chloe. Wilson shoved Arthur forward, Frob marching him toward the door. As they walked through the diner, Arthur kept his head high. He didn't look down in shame. He looked directly at the faces of the patrons. He wanted them to remember this. He wanted them to see exactly what their local police department was doing. Thomas Croft finally found his voice as they passed the register. "Officer Wilson, he really wasn't causing a disturbance." "Mind your business, Tom, unless you want the fire marshal doing a surprise inspection of your kitchen next week," Wilson snarled, kicking the heavy glass door open. The cold October air hit Arthur as he was dragged out onto the sidewalk. The few pedestrians stopped and stared, pulling out their smartphones. The sight of a black man in a ratty hoodie being roughly handled by a white police officer was unfortunately a familiar visual in the modern world. But seeing it happen on the quiet, manicured main street of Fairview was a shock to the locals. Wilson marched Arthur toward his patrol SUV, which was parked diagonally across two spots, its lights off but its presence dominating. He opened the rear door and roughly shoved Arthur inside. Because Arthur was tall, his head cracked against the door frame. "Watch your head," Wilson said with a cruel, mocking smirk, completely unapologetic. Arthur grunted, adjusting his broad shoulders in the cramped plastic back seat. He looked through the wire mesh separating the front and back. He could feel the circulation in his hands already starting to throb due to the overly tight cuffs. Wilson slammed the door shut, walked around the front of the vehicle, and slid into the driver's seat. He didn't immediately put the car in gear. Instead, he adjusted his mirror so he could look at Arthur's face. "You know, you people always think you can talk your way out of things," Wilson sneered, turning the key. The engine roared to life. "You watch a couple of YouTube videos about auditing the police, and you think you're Clarence Darrow. But out here, on the street, I am the law, and you just earned yourself a weekend in a holding cell." Arthur sat in the back, the smell of stale sweat, cheap institutional cleaner, and absolute corruption filling his nostrils. He looked at Wilson's smug eyes in the rearview mirror. "Officer Wilson," Arthur said, reading the man's name tag clearly. It was the first time he had used the man's name. "I highly suggest you call your watch commander before we reach the station. You have made a sequence of catastrophic errors this morning." "That hot hello thou wet. So, I'm our Jeanette. I shirted verbs." Wilson just laughed a harsh, barking sound. He flipped on his lights, entirely for theatrical effect, and peeled away from the curb, leaving the Oak Creek diner, a sobbing little girl, and a devastated community trust in his rearview mirror. The drive to the Fairview Police Department took less than 10 minutes. But for Officer Greg Wilson, it was a victory lap. He drove with one hand draped lazily over the steering wheel, the other tapping a rhythm against the center console. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the storefronts of Main Street, announcing to everyone that Officer Wilson had caught another bad guy. In the back seat, Arthur Pendleton sat in absolute silence. The initial adrenaline spike had receded, replaced by a cold, calculating hyper-focus. His wrists were in agonizing pain, the metal teeth of the cuffs biting deep into his skin with every bump in the road. He could feel a thin trickle of blood beginning to run down his left hand, soaking into the cuff of his hoodie. But Arthur wasn't thinking about the pain. He was mentally building the case. Violation of the Fourth Amendment, unlawful detention, false arrest, battery, assault under color of law, civil rights violations under 42 U.S.C. 10 to 7 Re. Section 1983. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. The list of charges he was compiling in his head was devastating. He knew the Fairview Police Department had been dodging rumors of racial profiling for years. The NAACP had filed complaints, but they usually resulted in internal investigations that quietly disappeared into the bureaucratic ether. It was a classic good old boys network, protected by a town council that preferred looking the other way as long as the crime rate stayed artificially low. Wilson glanced in the mirror, clearly disappointed by Arthur's silence. He wanted a reaction. He wanted pleading, shouting, or swearing something to validate his use of force. "Quiet now, huh?" Wilson taunted, taking a corner a little too fast, throwing Arthur hard against the plastic door. "Not so full of legal jargon now that you're in the cage. What's your name, anyway? John Doe? You got warrants. Is that why you didn't want to show me your little plastic card?" Eight. Out. Ram. Side. Upper. Fang. Arthur met Wilson's eyes in the mirror. His gaze was flat, devoid of any fear or submission. It was a look Arthur had perfected over years of sitting on the bench, staring down hardened criminals, lying witnesses and arrogant attorneys. It was a look of absolute, unshakable authority. "You will find out my name very soon, officer," Arthur said softly. "And I promise you, it is a name you will remember for the rest of your life." Wilson scoffed, rolling his eyes. Yeah, save it for the judge." "Oh, wait. You probably won't see a judge until Monday morning. Hope you liked bologna sandwiches." The irony of the statement was so profound that Arthur almost let out a dark chuckle. Save it for the judge. The cruiser turned onto Elm Street, pulling into the gated rear lot of the Fairview Police Precinct. It was a relatively new, brutalist brick building funded by the town's high property taxes. Wilson parked the SUV in the sallyport, cut the engine, and stepped out. He swaggered to the rear door, opened it, and grabbed Arthur by the arm, hauling him out with unnecessary force. "Move," Wilson commanded, pushing Arthur toward the heavy steel doors that led to the intake area. Arthur's legs were stiff, but he walked with perfect posture. As they entered the intake room, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The room smelled of bleach and burnt coffee. Behind an elevated desk sat Desk Sergeant Dave Higgins, a man in his late 50s who looked like he had been counting down the days to retirement for the past decade. Higgins was sipping coffee and looking at a computer screen. "What do we have here, Greg?" Higgins asked, not looking up immediately. "Got a live one from the Oak Creek Diner," Wilson declared loudly, practically dragging Arthur to the booking counter. "Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, failure to identify. Guy thinks he's a street lawyer. Refused to hand over ID, making a scene in front of families." Higgins sighed, finally looking up from his monitor. He looked at the tall black man in the faded hoodie. He looked at the grass-stained sweatpants. He looked at the tight handcuffs. And then he looked at Arthur's face. Sergeant Higgins froze. The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. The color drained from Higgins's ruddy, weathered face so fast it looked as though he were going into shock. Higgins was a 20-year veteran. He had been a courtroom bailiff before transferring to the desk. He knew the local judicial circuit inside and out. He knew the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, and he certainly knew the judges. Higgins blinked, convinced his tired eyes were playing a trick on him. He looked down at the computer, then back up at the man in handcuffs. "Greg," Higgins whispered, his voice trembling. He slowly put his coffee cup down. It clattered against the desk, a loud sound in the suddenly quiet room. "Empty your pockets," Wilson ordered Arthur, ignoring the sergeant. "Put your stuff on the counter. Then face the wall." Arthur didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Sergeant Higgins. "Hello, Dave," Arthur said. His voice was calm, conversational, but carried the lethal weight of an anvil dropping. Wilson looked back and forth between his sergeant and the prisoner. "You know this guy, Sarge? Frequent flyer?" Higgins stood up slowly. His hands were actually shaking. He looked at Wilson, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and utter disbelief. "Greg," Higgins said, his voice cracking, sounding like a man standing on the edge of a cliff watching the ground crumble beneath his feet. What the hell have you done? What are you talking about?" Wilson frowned, clearly confused by his superior's reaction. He was causing a disturbance. "Refused to ID. I brought him in." "Take those cuffs off," Higgins commanded, his voice suddenly rising to a panic-stricken shout. "Take them off right now." "Sarge, he hasn't been searched yet. Wilson! Take the damn cuffs off him now." Higgins roared, coming around from behind the desk, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Are you out of your goddamn mind? Do you have any idea who you just dragged in here?" Wilson hesitated, his hand hovering over his handcuff keys. The absolute panic in Sergeant Higgins' eyes finally pierced through Wilson's thick armor of arrogance. A tiny, cold sliver of doubt slid into Wilson's stomach. Who is he? Wilson asked, his voice losing its swagger, dropping to a confused mumble. Sergeant Higgins stopped a few feet from Arthur, looking at the bruised, bleeding wrists and the dirt on the man's knees. Higgins looked like he was about to be sick. "Officer Wilson," Higgins said, his voice dropping to a horrifyingly quiet register. "You have just arrested the Honorable Arthur Pendleton, Chief District Judge of the Fourth Circuit Court." The silence that followed was absolute. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded as loud as a chainsaw. Officer Greg Wilson stopped breathing. The color vanished from his face, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. Swaggering and truly noticed. The smug was the first test. That he was the ultimate authority in Fairview at all evaporated in a single heartbeat, leaving behind nothing but the cold, paralyzing realization that he had just ended his own life as he knew it. Judge Arthur Pendleton turned his head slowly, looking directly into the horrified wide eyes of the man who had just assaulted him. "Like I said in the car, Officer Wilson," Arthur said softly, "you have made a sequence of catastrophic errors this morning. Now, are you going to take these off, or should I wait for the Chief of Police to do it himself?" The handcuff keys sounded like a death knell as Officer Greg Wilson fumbled for them on his duty belt. His hands, previously so steady and forceful when manhandling a father in front of his child, were now violently trembling. He dropped the small silver key twice onto the linoleum floor before finally managing to insert it into the locking mechanism of the cuffs binding Judge Arthur Pendleton. Click, click, click. The heavy metal jaws released. Arthur brought his arms forward slowly. His wrists were severely bruised, dark purple rings already forming against his dark skin, and a thin line of blood from a deep scrape stained the cuff of his Georgetown hoodie. He didn't rub them. He didn't wince. He simply stood there, an immovable force of nature, watching the sweat bead and drip down Wilson's suddenly pallid face. "Judge Pendleton, sir, I am so incredibly sorry," Sergeant Higgins stammered, abandoning his post behind a desk and rushing forward with a roll of paper towels. "Let me get a medic to look at those wrists. This is a massive misunderstanding. A catastrophic failure in judgment." Arthur ignored the paper towels. He didn't break eye contact with Wilson, who was now backing away slowly, looking like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the inevitable click of the detonator. "Is it a misunderstanding, Sergeant Higgins?" Arthur asked, his voice echoing in the sterile intake room. "Because from where I was sitting, it felt quite deliberate. A man was enjoying breakfast with his 8-year-old daughter. He was approached without reasonable suspicion, demanded to produce papers like a citizen in a police state, physically assaulted, unlawfully arrested, and dragged through his community in handcuffs. Which part of that is a misunderstanding?" I didn't know who you were," Wilson finally choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy whisper compared to the booming bark he had used in the Oak Creek diner. It was the absolute worst thing he could have said. Arthur's eyes narrowed, a terrifying calmness washing over his features. "That, Officer Wilson, is exactly the point. You didn't know I was a judge. You saw a black man in a hoodie. You assumed I was a vagrant. You assumed I had no power, no voice, and no recourse. You acted exactly as you would have if I were a mechanic, a school teacher, or a delivery driver. My title is the only thing currently causing you regret." The heavy double doors of the precinct lobby suddenly flew open, crashing against the walls. In walked Robert Sterling, the chief of police for the city of Fairview. Sterling was supposed to be enjoying a Saturday morning tea time at the country club. Instead, he was wearing a bright pink polo shirt, khakis, and golf shoes that clacked frantically against the floor. His face was a map of sheer panic. Sarah Jenkins, the waitress from the diner, had called Arthur's wife Rebecca, who in turn had immediately dialed the mayor. The mayor had called Sterling on the second hole. "Arthur, "My God, Arthur," Chief Sterling gasped, rushing into the intake room completely out of breath. He looked at Arthur's bleeding wrists, then turned a look of pure, unadulterated venom toward Wilson. "Greg, what in the name of God have you done?" "Chief, I was doing routine patrol. He was acting suspicious." Wilson tried to fall back on his training, reciting the rote justifications that had saved his skin a dozen times before. "Shut up. Not another word." Sterling roared, spit flying from his lips. He turned back to Arthur, holding his hands up placatingly. "Arthur, Judge Pendleton, please. Let's go into my office. Let's sit down, have a coffee, and get this sorted out. You are free to go. We're shredding the booking paperwork right now." It never happened. Arthur looked at the chief of police, a man he had worked alongside for years, a man who routinely sat in his courtroom during high-profile arraignments. "No, Bob," Arthur said firmly. The rejection hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "Arthur, please, be reasonable." "This idiot made a mistake," Sterling pleaded, gesturing wildly at Wilson. "We'll handle this internally. I'll suspend him today. Just don't make this a public circus. And think of the town. Think of your family. My family is currently traumatized. My daughter watched a man with a badge put her father against a window. As for the town, they deserve to know who is patrolling their streets," Arthur stated, his legal mind locking every piece of evidence into place. He stepped back from the chief. "I am an arrestee, Chief Sterling. Officer Wilson brought me here on charges of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. I demand to be formally booked. I want my fingerprints taken. I want my mugshot taken. And I want to be placed in a holding cell until I am formally processed." Chief Sterling looked as if he had been physically struck. "Arthur, you can't be serious. If I book a sitting federal circuit judge on bogus charges, the Department of Justice will be down my throat by Monday morning." "Then you should have trained your officers to obey the Constitution," Arthur replied coldly. "Book me, Sergeant Higgins, or I will add dereliction of duty to the federal civil rights lawsuit I am filing on Monday." "Not all. For the next 2 hours, Arthur Pendleton sat in a sterile concrete holding cell. He refused medical treatment from the police department's EMTs, insisting that his injuries be documented by an independent physician. Outside his cell, the Fairview Police Department was descending into absolute chaos. Phones rang incessantly. The mayor arrived screaming in Chief Sterling's office, and Officer Greg Wilson sat at his desk, his badge and gun already stripped from him, staring at the blank wall, realizing that the protective bubble of his badge had finally, violently burst. When Rebecca Pendleton arrived, a fierce, brilliant corporate litigator in her own right, she didn't come alone. She walked through the front doors of the precinct, flanked by Jonathan Hayes, the most feared civil rights attorney in the state. When Arthur was finally released into his wife's arms, they didn't exit through the back alley to hide from the embarrassment. They walked right out the front door, Arthur holding his bruised wrists up high, straight into the flashing cameras of the local news crews that had already caught wind of the most explosive story of the decade. By Monday morning, the sleepy, affluent town of Fairview was at the epicenter of a national media firestorm. The story of a racist cop violently arresting a respected judge in front of his child over a plate of pancakes had everything the 24-hour news cycle hungered for. But Arthur Pendleton was not a man who fought his battles in the court of public opinion. He fought them in the courts of law, where he possessed a home field advantage unmatched by anyone in the state. Arthur officially recused himself from the bench for a month, taking a leave of absence to focus entirely on the impending legal war. He and Jonathan Hayes set up a war room in the Pendleton home. Hayes was a legal shark, a man who viewed police misconduct not just as a tragedy, but as a deeply profitable enterprise of justice. "The city's legal counsel reached out this morning," Hayes said, sitting across from Arthur and Rebecca at their dining room table, surrounded by stacks of case law and FOIA requests. "They offered $200,000 to make this go away quietly. They want an NDA, Rebecca, nursing a cup of tea, let out a sharp, cynical laugh. $200,000? Greg Wilson caused more than $200,000 of emotional damage to Chloe alone. She woke up screaming last night, thinking a police officer was coming to take Arthur away. Arthur's jaw muscles feathered. The mention of his daughter's trauma fueled a cold, methodical anger that burned far hotter than the initial rage in the diner. We aren't settling, not until they are bled dry and Wilson is permanently removed from law enforcement. The first major twist in the case came 48 hours later. Officer Wilson's initial defense, spoon-fed to him by his panicked police union representative, was that Arthur had made furtive movements and had aggressively threatened him in the diner. Wilson claimed his body camera had malfunctioned, a convenient, completely unbelievable excuse that happens all too often in excessive force cases. He assumed it would be his word against a civilian's, a contest he was used to winning. But Wilson hadn't accounted for Thomas Croft. Thomas, the manager of the Oak Creek Diner, had spent the weekend wrestling with his conscience. He had watched an innocent man get assaulted, and he had cowered. But seeing the news, seeing Arthur's stoic dignity, broke something open in Thomas. Against the direct threats of Officer Wilson and the quiet pressure of the local town council to stay out of it, Thomas walked into Jonathan Hayes' office on Tuesday afternoon carrying a silvery USB drive. It was the diner's high-definition security footage, complete with audio from the microphone positioned directly over the register, just feet from the corner booth. When Hayes released the footage to the public later that evening, it was a massacre. The video clearly showed Arthur sitting calmly. The sheer arrogance of Wilson's approach, the unlawful demand for identification, the brilliant legal rebuff by Arthur, and finally, the violent, unprovoked physical assault. It completely dismantled Wilson's fabricated police report. Within hours of the video airing on national television, the Fairview Police Union formally announced they were dropping their representation of Officer Greg Wilson. It was a stunning betrayal in the tight-knit world of law enforcement, but the union knew a sinking ship when they saw one. Defending a bad cop was one thing. Defending a bad cop who brutally assaulted a beloved sitting judge on HD video was a public relations suicide mission they weren't willing to undertake. Left isolated, Wilson was forced to hire a private defense attorney, draining his savings in a matter of days. He was suspended without pay, pending not just an internal affairs review, but a newly announced investigation by the Department of Justice for deprivation of rights under color of law. That Arthur and Hayes were not satisfied with just taking Wilson down. They were aiming for the entire bottom structure that had allowed a man like Wilson to wear a badge in the first place. They filed a massive federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Greg Wilson, Chief Robert Sterling, and the city of Fairview. The lawsuit alleged not only excessive force and false arrest, but introduced a Monell claim, a complex legal doctrine, asserting that the city of Fairview had a deeply ingrained, systemic custom of ignoring racial profiling and police brutality, making the city itself financially and legally liable for Wilson's actions. To prove the Monell claim, Hayes needed to dig into the Fairview Police Department's archives. The city fought the subpoenas tooth and nail, claiming privacy rights and burdensome administrative costs. But when the judge overseeing the discovery phase is a close colleague of the plaintiff, motions to compel evidence are granted with remarkable speed. What they found buried in the dusty digital archives of the precinct's internal affairs server was the karma Greg Wilson never saw coming. Discovery is where lawsuits are won or lost. It is the agonizing process of turning over every rock, reading every email, and exposing every skeleton in the closet. For the city of Fairview, the discovery phase was an unmitigated disaster. Jonathan Hayes uncovered a heavily encrypted secondary spreadsheet maintained by Chief Sterling's office. It was informally known among the command staff as the nuisance file. Inside were records of formal complaints filed by citizens over the past decade. Officer Greg Wilson's name appeared on that list 14 times in the last 6 years. 14 separate complaints, all from Black or Hispanic individuals, all detailing the exact same pattern of behavior, pretextual stops, demands for identification without reasonable suspicion, aggressive intimidation tactics, and arrests for disorderly conduct or resisting arrest that were miraculously dropped by prosecutors before they ever reached a courtroom. In every single instance, Chief Sterling had personally reviewed the complaint, ruled it unfounded, and buried it to protect the department's statistics and his officer's career. Wilson hadn't just made a mistake with Judge Pendleton. He was a serial abuser of power, enabled by a corrupt administration. 6 months after the incident at the diner, the legal proceedings culminated in a conference room in downtown Cleveland. It was time for Greg Wilson's sworn deposition. The room was suffocatingly tense. Arthur sat at the long mahogany table wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking every inch the formidable jurist he was. Beside him sat Jonathan Hayes, a thick binder of evidence resting ominously in front of him. Across the table sat Greg Wilson, looking 10 years older than he had in the diner. He had lost weight, his previously crisp posture was slumped, and the arrogant aviator sunglasses were nowhere to be seen. His private attorney, a tired-looking man named David Vance, sat beside him, nervously tapping a pen. "State your name for the record," Hayes began, leaning forward, the court reporter's fingers flying across the stenograph. "Gregory Thomas Wilson." Hayes didn't start with the diner. He started with the spreadsheet. For 4 agonizing hours, Hayes marched Wilson through every single buried complaint. He read the names of the victims. A teenage boy walking home from a tutoring session. A traveling nurse pulled over for going 2 miles over the speed limit. A landscaping contractor eating lunch in his truck. Officer Wilson, in the case of Marcus Johnson in 2021, you claimed he was acting aggressively. Yet the dashcam footage showed him simply asking why he was pulled over. Do you recall this? Hayes pressed his voice like a scalpel. It was a high-stressed situation. I perceived a threat, Wilson mumbled, his eyes darting toward Arthur, who was staring at him with the cold, unblinking intensity of a predator. 14 times, Mr. Wilson, Hayes said loudly, dropping the binder onto the table with a loud smack that made Wilson flinch. 14 identical complaints from 14 different minorities. Did you perceive a threat 14 times from individuals who would ultimately charge with absolutely nothing? Wilson's lawyer intervened. Objection, relevance. We are here to discuss the incident with Judge Pendleton. It goes directly to the pattern and practice of this officer and the Manel liability of the city. Hayes shot back smoothly. He turned back to Wilson. Let's move to October 12th. The Oak Creek Diner. When you approached my client, what exact crime did you suspect him of committing? Wilson swallowed hard. His throat was bone dry. He looked out of place. There had been reports of transients. You are under oath, Mr. Wilson? Arthur spoke for the first time. His deep, resonant voice sent a physical chill down Wilson's spine. I live 4 blocks from that diner. I have lived there for 12 years. I was eating pancakes with my child. What articulable suspicion of a crime did you possess to demand my identification? Wilson stuttered, the walls closing in. He looked at his lawyer, desperate for a lifeline, but the lawyer just stared at his legal pad. There was no defense. Isn't it true, Mr. Crew, Wilson, Hayes interjected, leaning over the table, that the only reason you approached Judge Pendleton is because he was a black man in a wealthy neighborhood wearing a hoodie? Isn't it true that your ego was bruised when a citizen knew the law better than you did? And isn't it true that you used physical violence to punish him for his intelligence? No, that's not true. Wilson finally cracked, his voice rising in a desperate panic whine. I was doing my job. I am a good cop. I keep that town safe. People like him. People coming in. Wilson stopped abruptly, realizing what he was about to say on the official record. The silence in the deposition room was deafening. Even Wilson's own lawyer rubbed his eyes in defeat. The mask had slipped entirely. People like me? Arthur asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like an executioner's axe. Wilson slumped back in his chair, putting his head in his hands. He was a ruined man, He had just confessed his bias on tape. He knew it. His lawyer knew it. And Arthur knew it. Following the disastrous deposition, the City of Fairview's legal counsel called an emergency meeting with the mayor and the city council. The city was facing a jury trial in a federal court with a plaintiff who was a revered judge, backed by irrefutable HD video evidence and a deposition where the offending officer practically admitted to racial profiling and systemic corruption. If the case went to a jury, the punitive damages alone could bankrupt the municipality. They had no choice but to surrender unconditionally. The unconditional surrender of the City of Fairview was not a quiet affair held behind closed doors. Judge Arthur Pendleton and his attorney, Jonathan Hayes, refused to allow the municipality to sweep their systemic failures under the rug with a confidential payer. The terms they dictated were draconian, public, and designed to permanently alter the landscape of the town's law enforcement. On a rainy Tuesday morning, the Fairview City Council convened a special emergency public session. The chamber was packed to the fire marshal's absolute limit, buzzing with local citizens, regional activists, and a swarm of news cameras. Mayor Thomas Harding, looking pale and thoroughly defeated, read the terms of the settlement into the public record. The city agreed to pay a staggering $1.1 million in compensatory and punitive damages to the Pendleton family. The financial blow was only the beginning. As part of the legally binding consent decree, the Fairview Police Department was placed under the direct supervision of an independent civilian oversight board. Every single internal affairs complaint from the past decade was to be reopened and investigated by a third-party auditing firm. Furthermore, Chief Robert Sterling was given an ultimatum: resign immediately and forfeit his accumulated administrative bonuses, or face a public firing and a potential state investigation for obstruction of justice regarding the hidden nuisance file. Sterling, a man who had built a career on protecting his own at the expense of the public, chose the coward's way out. He submitted his resignation the very next day, slipping out the back door of the precinct he had mismanaged for years, his reputation completely destroyed. But the most profound, crushing wave of karma was reserved for the man who had started it all. Officer Greg Wilson did not get to quietly resign. He did not get to transfer to a neighboring county and put on a different uniform. Upon the conclusion of the civil settlement, the Department of Justice officially unsealed the federal indictment against him. Wilson was arrested by FBI agents at his home, handcuffed on his own front lawn in full view of his neighbors. He was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a severe federal felony. During his criminal trial, the devastating footage from the Oak Creek diner was played again and again. The jury took less than 3 hours to deliberate. When the verdict was read, Wilson collapsed into his chair, weeping silently. He was sentenced to 36 months in a federal penitentiary. Upon his felony conviction, the state's Peace Officer Training Commission permanently revoked his law enforcement certification. He lost his pension, he lost his badge, he lost his freedom. The man who had terrorized his community with arbitrary power had been utterly stripped of it by the very legal system he had sworn to uphold, but consistently mocked. When Wilson eventually walked out of prison 3 years later, he was a convicted felon, unemployable in any position of authority, forced to work graveyard shifts at a distribution warehouse 2 states away, forever burdened by the digital footprint of his arrogance. As for Arthur Pendleton, he did not keep a single dime of the $1.1 million settlement. In a press conference held on the steps of the federal courthouse, with his wife Rebecca holding his hand and his daughter Chloe standing proudly beside them, Arthur announced the creation of the Equal Justice Foundation. The entire settlement was placed into a trust dedicated to providing elite civil rights legal representation for marginalized individuals who had been victimized by police misconduct but lacked the financial resources to fight back. The very money the city paid to cover up Greg Wilson's abuse would now be used to hunt down every other corrupt officer in the state. A month after the settlement, Arthur returned to the Fourth Circuit Court. The courtroom was packed. When the bailiff announced his entrance, the silence in the room was electric. Arthur stepped up to the bench wearing his flowing black robes. His wrists had fully healed, leaving no physical scars, but the experience had sharpened his judicial mind to a razor's edge. He looked out over the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, and the defendants. He was no longer just a judge. He was a living testament to the absolute necessity of constitutional boundaries. When he struck his gavel that morning, the sound was deafening, a declaration that the law applies to everyone, especially those who wear a badge. A year later, on a crisp October morning, the bell above the glass door of the Oak Creek Diner chimed. Arthur and Chloe walked in. Arthur was wearing the exact same faded navy blue Georgetown University hoodie. Chloe, now 9, was wearing her new soccer jersey. The diner was bustling. Thomas Croft, the manager, rushed out from behind the counter with a massive, genuine smile, shaking Arthur's hand warmly. Sarah Jenkins, who was now a fully registered nurse but still visited the diner on weekends for coffee, came over and gave Chloe a tight hug. They sat in the exact same corner booth by the window. The sunlight streamed in, warming the table. There were no arrogant shadows. There was no fear. Just a father and his daughter, laughing over a plate of chocolate chip pancakes with extra whipped cream, in a town that was finally, truly safe. If this unbelievable true story of absolute justice and the undeniable power of knowing your constitutional rights resonated with you, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends and family. Stories like this prove that while corruption and arrogance may wear a badge, the truth, backed by the law, is the ultimate equalizer. We need to keep sharing these stories to hold those in power accountable and to remind everyone that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. What would you have done if you were sitting in that diner watching this unfold? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the most incredible, dramatic, real-life stories of karma and justice. Stay safe, know your rights, and I'll see you in the next video.